At just after 11 in the evening local time, radar operators aboard a U.S. Navy-guided missile destroyer operating in the Gulf picked up a fast-moving contact separating from the Iranian coastline, closing distance far too quickly to be anything other than a deliberate launch. Within seconds, the contact was confirmed as an anti-ship cruise missile fired directly at the destroyer from a mobile coastal battery, the first confirmed direct missile attack on a U.S. warship by Iranian forces in this entire conflict. What happened in the next 90 seconds is the part of this story that is going to define how the rest of this war is fought. The destroyer's defensive systems engaged automatically, intercepting the inbound missile well outside the ship's own hull, and before the debris from that intercept had even settled into the water, the same destroyer had already returned fire. Not a token defensive shot, but a full retaliatory strike against the exact battery that had launched at it, using targeting data the ship had been tracking for hours before the missile was ever fired. Iran took the first shot in a direct ship-to-shore missile exchange in this conflict. The United States Navy's answer arrived faster than most analysts thought this kind of response was even doctrinally capable of happening. I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened during those 90 seconds, how a warship identifies, intercepts, and retaliates against a launch this fast without a single human being able to consciously process the entire sequence in real time, and why the specific way the Navy responded here may represent a genuine shift in how this entire naval conflict is fought from this point forward. Stay with me, because there's a detail about what that coastal battery was actually protecting that most coverage of this incident has completely missed. Before I walk you through the sequence, I want to be upfront about how I'm approaching a story this fast-moving, because an incident like this one, a direct missile exchange between Iranian and American forces, produces an enormous amount of adrenaline-driven speculation within the first few hours, and the entire value of a breakdown like this one depends on resisting that temptation and sticking closely to what is actually confirmed. My background is in naval warfare and shipboard defense systems, specifically how modern Aegis-equipped destroyers detect, track, and engage incoming threats in real time. That's the lens I'm bringing to this video, where something is confirmed by official Navy statements or independent tracking, I'll say so plainly. Where it remains genuinely unconfirmed or disputed among people who study this for a living, I'll tell you that too. Let's get into exactly what happened. To understand why this incident matters as much as it does, you first need to understand what makes a direct missile launch at a U.S. warship such a fundamentally different category of event than nearly everything else we've covered in this conflict so far. Throughout this war, Iran and its affiliated forces have relied heavily on indirect, deniable, or asymmetric methods of pressuring American naval presence in the region. Electronic jamming and communications blackouts, fast boat harassment, mine-laying activity, and the kind of saturation drone and rocket attacks against land-based installations we've discussed in earlier videos. What every one of those methods has in common is a built-in layer of deniability or ambiguity that has, up to this point, allowed both sides to manage the conflict without crossing into the kind of unambiguous, direct military engagement that immediately triggers the most severe categories of retaliatory doctrine. A cruise missile fired directly from a known Iranian coastal battery at a specifically identified U.S. warship removes all of that ambiguity in a single instant. There is no plausible deniability available for a missile launch tracked in real time by the exact ship it was fired at. This is, by any reasonable definition, the most direct and unambiguous act of war Iran has committed against American forces at any point in this entire conflict. The location matters here as much as the act itself. Mobile coastal anti-ship batteries, like the one involved in this launch, are a core piece of Iran's broader asymmetric naval strategy, designed specifically to hold American and Allied shipping at risk along the narrowest, most heavily trafficked stretches of the Gulf without requiring Iran to risk its own limited blue water naval assets in a direct confrontation it cannot realistically win. These systems are deliberately kept mobile, relocated frequently between hardened or camouflaged positions along the coastline, specifically to complicate any effort to locate and preemptively neutralize them before they can be used. The fact that American forces were able to identify, track, and retaliate against this specific battery within seconds of it firing tells you something important right from the outset about how closely this exact category of threat has been monitored throughout this conflict, a detail we're going to come back to later in this video, because it directly connects to the part of this story most coverage has gotten wrong. This mobile coastal missile strategy is, in many ways, the naval equivalent of the dispersed, deliberately concealed infrastructure we discussed in an earlier video covering a hidden coastal facility elsewhere in Iran. The same underlying logic of denying an adversary a fixed, easily targetable location, applied specifically to anti-ship weapons rather than storage and staging infrastructure. Iran has invested heavily in this approach precisely because a fixed, permanent coastal missile installation would be relatively straightforward for American and Allied surveillance to locate and neutralize early in any conflict, while a genuinely mobile, frequently relocated battery forces, an adversary to either maintain continuous, resource-intensive surveillance over a wide stretch of coastline, or accept that any given battery might be able to fire at least once before its position is confirmed and a response can be organized. That trade-off, accepting a somewhat less consistently ready weapon system in exchange for a dramatically reduced risk of preemptive destruction, has shaped Iran's coastal missile doctrine for years, well before this current conflict began. Understanding that broader doctrine helps explain why this specific incident is being read as such a significant test of American surveillance capability in the region. If a genuinely well-concealed, frequently relocated mobile battery can still be identified, tracked, and struck within minutes of firing, that suggests American and Allied intelligence coverage of Iran's coastline has reached a level of persistence and detail that meaningfully undermines the core assumption behind Iran's entire mobile coastal missile strategy: the assumption that mobility alone provides a reliable enough margin of safety to make these systems a viable long-term threat throughout a sustained conflict. Let's walk through the sequence itself in more detail, because the speed and precision of what happened here is genuinely remarkable from a technical standpoint, independent of the broader strategic implications. The destroyer involved was operating as part of a broader American naval presence in the Gulf, equipped with the Aegis Combat System, an integrated network of radar, computing, and weapons control systems specifically designed to detect, track, and engage multiple incoming threats simultaneously, often faster than any human operator could process manually. When the coastal battery fired, the missile's launch, signature, and subsequent flight path were picked up almost immediately by the destroyer's radar systems, which automatically began calculating an intercept solution using the ship's close-in defensive weapons, systems specifically designed for exactly this scenario: a fast, low-altitude anti-ship missile closing distance in a matter of seconds rather than minutes. The intercept itself, according to Navy officials who addressed the incident in the hours afterward, occurred well outside the destroyer's own hull. Consistent with the layered defensive doctrine, every Aegis-equipped ship trains for constantly. Intercepting an inbound threat as far from the ship as physically possible, rather than waiting until the missile is close enough that a successful intercept still risks debris or secondary damage to the vessel itself. That outcome, a clean, well-clear intercept against a genuine anti-ship cruise missile fired with hostile intent, represents exactly the kind of real-world validation of shipboard defensive systems that training exercises and simulations can never fully replicate. Because a simulated missile does not carry the same unpredictable variables, actual Iranian targeting choices, actual missile performance characteristics, actual real-time decision pressure that a genuine hostile launch does. It's worth understanding, briefly, just how compressed the actual decision-making timeline is in a scenario like this one, because it explains why systems like Aegis are built the way they are. A modern anti-ship cruise missile fired from a coastal battery at this kind of range can close the distance to a target vessel in well under 2 minutes. Sometimes considerably less, depending on the missile's speed and flight profile. That leaves an almost impossibly narrow window for detection, threat classification, intercept calculation, and weapons engagement. A sequence that would be effectively impossible for human operators to complete manually within the available time. This is precisely why the Aegis Combat System is built around a heavily automated engagement architecture, where the ship's own radar and computing systems handle the vast majority of the detection, tracking, and intercept calculation process autonomously, with human operators positioned to authorize and oversee the engagement rather than manually execute each individual step. The entire defensive doctrine underlying ships like this destroyer exists specifically because a threat moving this fast requires a response speed that only a heavily automated system can reliably deliver. And this incident represents exactly the kind of real-world scenario that architecture was built to handle. There's also a crew dimension to this story worth sitting with for a moment, separate from the technical systems involved. Every sailor aboard that destroyer went from a routine watch rotation to a live, hostile missile engagement within the span of roughly 2 minutes, with no advance warning beyond whatever the ship's own sensors picked up in real time. The training, discipline, and procedural readiness required for a crew to execute a defensive engagement and immediate retaliatory strike. This cleanly, under genuine combat pressure rather than a simulated exercise, reflects years of accumulated training investment being tested under exactly the kind of high-stakes, no-notice conditions that training exists to prepare for. That human element, a crew executing a complex, high-pressure sequence correctly on the first genuine attempt, is easy to overlook against the more dramatic, technical, and strategic elements of this story. But it's arguably just as significant to the outcome as the automated systems themselves. What happened immediately afterward is where this incident becomes genuinely unusual, even by the standards of a conflict that has already produced several dramatic retaliatory strikes. Naval doctrine around responding to a direct attack on a warship typically involves a command decision process, confirming the threat, confirming the source, and receiving the necessary authorization before any retaliatory strike is launched. A process that, even when executed efficiently, usually takes considerably longer than the handful of minutes that separated the missile intercept from the destroyer's own retaliatory strike against the coastal battery. According to Navy officials, the destroyer had already been tracking the general area from which the missile was ultimately launched for an extended period beforehand, as part of routine surveillance of known or suspected coastal battery positions throughout the region, meaning that when the missile was actually fired, the ship's targeting systems did not need to locate the source of the attack from scratch. They needed only to confirm that the already tracked position was, in fact, the source of the launch, a confirmation that can happen almost instantaneously when a ship is already maintaining a targeting track on a specific location. This is the detail about what that coastal battery was actually protecting that most coverage of this incident has missed entirely. Satellite imagery of the strike site, taken in the days following the exchange, shows that the destroyer's retaliatory strike did not simply destroy the mobile launcher itself. It also struck what analysts have identified as a nearby camouflaged storage and command position, a facility believed to be coordinating not just this single battery, but a broader network of mobile coastal missile positions along that stretch of shoreline. If that assessment holds up, the significance of this incident extends considerably beyond a single missile exchange between one destroyer and one launcher. It suggests American forces had already built a detailed enough intelligence picture of this specific coastal missile network, likely over weeks or months of surveillance, to strike not just the immediate threat, but the coordinating infrastructure behind it within minutes of the initial attack, using targeting data that had almost certainly been prepared and refined well before this particular missile was ever fired. That detail reframes the entire incident. Rather than reading this purely as a reactive defensive success, a ship successfully protecting itself and then striking back at the specific threat that attacked it, the destruction of the coordinating command position suggests a considerably more proactive posture. American naval forces operating in the Gulf appear to have already identified this entire coastal missile network as a standing threat worth maintaining, detailed, continuous targeting data on, effectively pre-positioned to respond not just to the immediate attacker, but to the broader system enabling it, the moment any single element of that network crossed the line into an actual attack. That is a meaningfully different and considerably more sophisticated defensive posture than simply reacting to an isolated incident as it happens. Building and maintaining that kind of standing targeting picture on a mobile, deliberately concealed threat network is a genuinely difficult, resource-intensive intelligence undertaking, and it's worth being specific about what it actually requires. Continuous surveillance of a stretch of coastline using a combination of satellite imagery, signals intelligence capable of picking up the communications traffic between individual batteries and their coordinating command structure, and likely some degree of human intelligence providing ground-level confirmation of positions and movement patterns that overhead surveillance alone can miss. Maintaining that picture accurately enough to strike within minutes of an actual launch, rather than needing hours or days to develop a fresh targeting solution from scratch, implies a sustained intelligence effort that has likely been running for a considerable period before this specific incident, rather than something assembled hastily in response to the attack itself. That is precisely the kind of capability that tends to remain invisible and unremarkable for as long as it's simply being maintained in the background, only becoming visible to outside observers at the exact moment it gets used, which is part of why this incident is being read as such a significant data point about the broader state of American intelligence coverage across Iran's coastal missile infrastructure. If this prepositioned targeting picture extends to other coastal missile batteries beyond the one involved in this specific incident, and there's no obvious reason it wouldn't, given that Iran's mobile coastal missile network operates as a broadly similar, interconnected system across multiple stretches of shoreline that has significant implications for how Iran's remaining coastal forces have to assess their own operational security going forward. Every battery commander within that network now has real reason to question whether their own current position, however carefully concealed or recently relocated, might already be sitting inside the same kind of standing American targeting picture that this specific battery apparently was. An uncertainty that is likely to weigh heavily on any future decision to actually fire on an American vessel, regardless of the tactical opportunity that decision might otherwise present. Let's talk about what this specific weapon system tells us about the nature of the threat Iran is now willing to use directly against American ships. The anti-ship cruise missile involved in this launch belongs to a category of weapon Iran has spent years developing and proliferating throughout its regional proxy network, specifically because these systems offer a genuinely credible threat, to even sophisticated naval vessels when used in sufficient numbers or with effective targeting, unlike the smaller rockets and drones that have characterized most of the attacks on land-based American installations throughout this conflict. A single successful anti-ship missile strike against a major naval vessel would represent a categorically more severe escalation than anything Iran has achieved throughout the rest of this war, both in terms of the immediate physical and human cost, and in terms of the psychological and political shock a successful strike against a U.S. warship would produce globally. The fact that Iran was willing to use this specific category of weapon rather than continuing to rely on the lower intensity harassment tactics that have defined most of its naval activity up to this point is itself a significant signal about how the regime's own risk calculus may be shifting as this conflict continues. There's genuine debate among analysts about why Iran made this specific choice at this specific moment, given how predictable and severe the American response to a direct missile attack on a warship was always going to be. Several regional analysts have suggested this may represent a calculated escalation, an attempt by elements within Iran's military leadership to demonstrate continued capability and resolve after a string of setbacks throughout this conflict, even at the cost of provoking a severe and immediate retaliatory strike. Others have pointed to the possibility that this specific battery may have acted with a degree of local autonomy inconsistent with, or at least not fully coordinated with, Iran's broader central command structure, a pattern that has occasionally emerged elsewhere in this conflict among Iran's more dispersed and loosely coordinated coastal and proxy forces. Distinguishing between a centrally authorized escalation and a more localized, less coordinated action matters enormously for understanding what Iran's broader leadership actually intends going forward. And right now, that distinction remains genuinely unresolved based on the publicly available evidence. There's a third possibility worth considering as well, one that several analysts have raised without fully committing to it, given the current uncertainty, that this launch may reflect a deliberate probing action, an attempt to test the actual real-world response time and effectiveness of American shipboard defenses under genuine combat conditions, information that would be genuinely valuable to Iranian military planners, regardless of whether the missile itself succeeded, since even a failed attack that reveals meaningful data about how quickly and precisely American forces can detect, intercept, and retaliate provides intelligence value that a purely symbolic or emotionally motivated attack would not. If that reading is accurate, this incident may have been less about attempting to actually damage or destroy the destroyer, an outcome Iranian planners may well have assessed as unlikely against a fully alert Aegis-equipped vessel, and more about gathering exactly the kind of real-world performance data this incident ended up producing, however costly that data collection ultimately proved to be for the specific battery involved. Each of these three explanations, a deliberate leadership-authorized escalation, a more localized and less coordinated decision, or a calculated probing action accepting the near certainty of losing the battery involved, carries meaningfully different implications for how Iran is likely to behave going forward. A centrally authorized escalation would suggest Iran's leadership has concluded that demonstrating continued willingness to directly engage American forces, even at real cost, serves some broader strategic or domestic political purpose worth the risk. A more localized, uncoordinated decision would suggest the kind of command and control fragmentation that tends to make a conflict's trajectory considerably harder to predict, since decisions with major strategic consequences are effectively being made below the level of Iran's actual national leadership. And a deliberate probing action would suggest Iran is treating this stage of the conflict less as an attempt to win individual engagements and more as an intelligence-gathering exercise ahead of some future, more consequential attempt. A genuinely unsettling possibility, if accurate, since it implies further direct attacks should be expected specifically because this one, despite failing tactically, may have succeeded in providing exactly the information Iranian planners were actually after. Iran's official response to the incident has followed a pattern we've discussed before in this conflict, acknowledging that an exchange occurred while offering a version of events that diverges meaningfully from the American account, describing the missile launch as a defensive response to what Iranian officials characterized as provocative American naval movements in the area, without directly addressing the specific sequence of events, the missile launch, the intercept, and the subsequent retaliatory strike, that American officials and independent trackers have described. That divergence in the two sides' public accounts is likely to persist, since neither government has a strong incentive to offer a version of events that concedes responsibility for initiating what both sides clearly understand to be an unusually serious escalation in this conflict. Let's pull back and talk about what this incident means for the broader trajectory of the naval conflict, because a direct missile exchange of this kind changes the calculus for every American vessel operating in the Gulf going forward, not just the ship directly involved. First, and most immediately, this incident provides real, combat-tested validation of the layered defensive systems American destroyers rely on throughout the region, a genuinely significant data point for naval planners who have spent years investing in exactly this kind of integrated defense architecture without having the opportunity to test it under real hostile conditions against an actual anti-ship missile fired with genuine intent to inflict damage. That validation matters enormously for how confidently American commanders can continue operating close to Iran's coastline for the remainder of this conflict, since a defensive failure in an incident like this one would have forced a considerably more cautious, risk-averse naval posture across the entire theater. Second, the speed and precision of the retaliatory strike, particularly the apparent destruction of the coordinating command position alongside the immediate launcher, sends an unmistakable signal to every other coastal missile battery Iran maintains along its shoreline that the United States likely already possesses detailed targeting data on positions Iran may have assumed were still effectively hidden, or, at minimum, safe from immediate retaliation. That signal alone is likely to shape how Iran's remaining coastal missile forces operate for the rest of this conflict, forcing a choice between accepting a meaningfully higher risk of immediate, precise retaliation for any future launch, or reducing the operational tempo of exactly the kind of asymmetric coastal threat that has been central to Iran's broader naval strategy throughout this war. Third, this incident forces a broader reassessment of how close this conflict actually is to a sustained, direct military confrontation between American and Iranian forces, as opposed to the more indirect, asymmetric, and often deniable confrontations that have characterized most of the war up to this point. A direct missile exchange between a named Iranian coastal battery and a specifically identified American warship is a considerably harder incident to manage through the kind of ambiguous, deniable framing that has allowed both sides to continue this conflict without triggering the most severe categories of escalation. Whether this specific incident remains an isolated, contained exchange, or whether it represents the opening moment of a more sustained pattern of direct ship-to-shore engagements, is likely to become clear based on how Iran's remaining coastal forces behave in the days immediately following this strike. It's also worth considering the deterrence logic that likely shaped how quickly and how completely this specific retaliatory strike was executed. A response this fast and this precise sends a message considerably more significant than the physical damage to a single launcher and command position, however important that damage may prove to be tactically. It demonstrates in the clearest possible terms that any future direct attack on an American vessel in this theater is likely to be met with an immediate, well-prepared, and precisely targeted response, removing whatever incentive Iranian commanders might otherwise have had to believe a direct attack could be executed with any meaningful window of safety before American forces could identify and respond to the threat. That kind of demonstrated response speed is, in its own right, a form of deterrence independent of the specific tactical outcome of this single engagement, and it's likely to factor heavily into how Iran's remaining coastal forces weigh the risk of any future direct attack against American shipping in the Gulf. This kind of demonstrated response speed also has value that extends well beyond the immediate theater of this specific conflict. Naval deterrence, in general, rests heavily on an adversary's belief about what will actually happen in the moments immediately following an attack, not simply on the theoretical capability a defending force possesses on paper. A country can maintain an enormously sophisticated defensive architecture that nonetheless fails to deter attacks if adversaries doubt that architecture will actually perform as designed under real combat conditions, doubt that tends to erode gradually the longer a defensive system goes untested in genuine hostile engagements. This incident removes a meaningful amount of that doubt, for Iran specifically, but also for any other actor anywhere in the world who might otherwise have questioned how quickly and effectively an Aegis-equipped American destroyer can actually respond to a genuine, no-notice missile attack. Demonstrated capability, tested under real conditions rather than simulated ones, carries a different, more durable kind of deterrent weight than capability that exists only in training exercises and technical specifications. There's also an important allied and international dimension to this incident worth addressing. Naval forces from partner nations operating alongside American vessels throughout this conflict, along with commercial shipping companies and their insurers who have been closely monitoring the security situation in the Gulf throughout this entire war, are almost certainly reassessing their own risk calculations in light of this incident. A confirmed direct missile attack against a U.S. warship, even one successfully intercepted without damage, represents a meaningful escalation in the overall threat environment across the Gulf. And it's reasonable to expect at least some short-term increase in war risk insurance premiums and heightened caution among commercial vessels transiting the region in the immediate aftermath, similar to the kind of market response we discussed following the Karg Island incident earlier in this conflict. Allied navies operating alongside American forces throughout this conflict are likely drawing a somewhat different, though related lesson from this incident. For partner nations contributing their own vessels to the broader coalition presence in the Gulf, This incident serves as a concrete demonstration of exactly the kind of threat their own ships could plausibly face under similar circumstances, and a useful, if unwelcome, real-world data point for how effectively layered defensive systems comparable to Aegis actually perform against a genuine anti-ship missile attack. Several Allied navies operate their own variants of similarly sophisticated integrated defense systems, and the successful outcome of this specific engagement is likely to reinforce confidence in that broader category of defensive architecture across the coalition, even as it simultaneously underscores just how real and immediate the threat from Iran's coastal missile network actually is for any vessel operating in these waters. Let me bring this down to what actually matters here, beyond the tactical and strategic analysis. For the first time in this entire war, Iran fired a missile directly at a named, specifically identified American warship. And for the first time in this entire war, that warship's own defensive systems worked exactly as designed, protecting the crew aboard without a single American casualty, before striking back with a speed and precision that reflects years of accumulated intelligence work and defensive investment finally being tested under real hostile conditions. That outcome, an American warship successfully defending itself and its crew against a direct, genuine attack, deserves to be understood clearly on its own terms, independent of whatever comes next in this rapidly evolving conflict. It's worth remembering, too, just how much distance separates a successful outcome like this one from the alternative that was genuinely possible in those first few seconds after the missile launch was detected. Every layer of that defensive system, the radar detection, the automated tracking, the intercept calculation, the actual engagement, had to function correctly, in sequence, within a window measured in seconds, for this incident to end the way it did. A failure at any single point in that chain could have produced an outcome this channel would be covering very differently right now, with a very different tone and a very different set of implications for the rest of this conflict. That razor-thin margin between the outcome we actually got and a considerably darker alternative is easy to lose sight of once the story shifts toward strategic analysis and retaliatory strikes. But it's worth sitting with directly, if only for a moment, before moving on to what happens next. Before you go, I want to ask you two things directly. First, if this breakdown gave you a clearer, more careful picture of what actually happened during this exchange than the shorter clips and dramatic headlines circulating elsewhere, share it with one person who's trying to make sense of this conflict. That's genuinely the only way careful analysis like this reaches people, instead of getting buried under louder, less careful content. Second, I want your read in the comments. Here's where this stands. An Iranian mobile coastal battery fired an anti-ship cruise missile directly at a U.S. Navy destroyer operating in the Gulf, marking the first confirmed direct missile attack on an American warship in this entire conflict. The destroyer's Aegis-equipped defensive systems successfully intercepted the missile well clear of the ship, resulting in no American casualties or damage before the destroyer launched an immediate retaliatory strike against the launcher, and, according to satellite imagery, a nearby command and coordination position, using targeting data that appears to have been maintained on this specific coastal missile network well before this particular attack occurred. That detail suggests American naval forces had already built a detailed intelligence picture of this coastal threat network, positioning them to respond not just to the immediate attacker, but to the broader coordinating infrastructure behind it within minutes of the initial launch. Analysts remain genuinely divided over whether this attack represents a deliberate, centrally authorized escalation from Iran's leadership or a more localized, less coordinated decision, and Iran's official account of the incident diverges meaningfully from the American version of events, a divergence likely to persist given the incentives both sides have to manage the narrative around what is clearly understood, by both governments, to be one of the most serious direct escalations of the entire naval conflict. Whatever Iran's underlying intent, the demonstrated speed, precision, and defensive effectiveness of the American response is likely to shape how every remaining coastal missile position in Iran's arsenal weighs the risk of any future direct attack on American shipping in the Gulf. Stay locked in on this one, because how Iran's remaining coastal forces respond in the coming days will tell us whether this was an isolated exchange or the opening moment of a considerably more direct phase of this entire naval conflict.